The morning my uncle threw my mother's jewelry box into the trash was the morning I understood that I had never been a person to him. I had always been a problem. I was 26 when I moved back to Harrowfield. People from Harrowfield don't usually come back voluntarily. It's the kind of town that gets smaller every time you return, like a sweater that shrinks in the wash. But my mother had died 3 weeks earlier, and my uncle had called to tell me there were things to sort out, and I had driven 8 hours from Charlotte, with 2 suitcases and a grief that hadn't found its shape yet. My name is Willa. My mother sent me a mother $7. A woman she described as someone who never asked permission for anything. I used to think that was a compliment. I'm still deciding. My mother's name was June. She raised me alone in a yellow house on Birch Creek Road with a leaky kitchen faucet she never got around to fixing, and a garden that grew tomatoes every summer without anyone tending it. She worked the front desk at a physical therapy clinic for 18 years. She made her own curtains. She kept a handwritten recipe book that smelled like vanilla and old paper. She died of a cardiac event on a Tuesday, which felt wrong. Tuesdays were supposed to be ordinary. My uncle, her older brother, had always been the kind of man who stood slightly too close when he talked to you. His name is Randall. He wore the same style of leather jacket every winter, drove a truck that was always clean, and spoke about money the way some people speak about God. Like it explained everything. Like it forgave everything. I hadn't been close with Randall since I was a teenager. My mother used to make excuses for the distance. He has a lot going on, she'd say, and that voice she used when she meant the opposite of what she was saying. But she never told me what, exactly, he had going on. I didn't ask. I was 22 and living in Charlotte and busy constructing a life out of student loan debt and roommates, and a job at a veterinary clinic where I learned that some animals are calmer when they can't see what's coming. I should have paid more attention to that. The house on Birch Creek Road smelled like her when I walked in. Lavender from the dryer sheets she used, coffee that no one had made. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a long time, not moving, because moving meant beginning something I wasn't ready to begin. Randall was already there. He was sitting at my mother's kitchen table with a folder in front of him and a coffee mug. My mother's mug, the blue one with the chipped handle. And he looked up when I came in and said, "Good, you're finally here." Not, "I'm sorry, Willa." Not, "She would have been glad you came." Just, "Good, you're finally here." The folder on the table was thick. I didn't ask what was in it yet. I put my bag down. I made myself a glass of water. I sat across from him at the table where I had eaten 10,000 breakfasts as a child. "We need to go over the will," he said. "Can I have one day?" I said. I gesture of 8 hours. He looked at me the way people look at a stain they've already decided to ignore. "The estate attorney has a window on Thursday. It's better if we're aligned before we go in." Aligned. I remember that word. I remember thinking it was a strange way to talk about a dead woman's wishes. I told him Thursday was fine. That night, alone in my mother's house, I opened her recipe book and read the handwriting I would never see in a new form again, and I cried in the way you cry when there's no one to hear you. Not quietly, but not dramatically either. Just thoroughly. I found the jewelry box the next morning. My mother's 7th appointment. Had it on the dresser in her bedroom since before I was born. Dark wood, brass hinges, a tiny mirror on the inside of the lid that she'd taped a photograph to. Me at about 7 years old, missing both front teeth, holding a fish I'd caught at the lake near her sister's house in Vermont. She'd kept that photograph there for nearly 20 years. The box was on top of the trash can in the hallway, just sitting there. I stood and looked at it for a second before I understood what I was seeing. "That's trash," Randall said from behind me. He was coming out of the guest room with a box in his arms. He'd apparently started going through my mother's things without asking, without telling me, possibly before I'd even arrived. Most of it's costume stuff, not worth anything. I picked up the jewelry box. I held it. The photograph of 7-year-old me was still inside. "This belonged to my mother," I said. "And now she's gone," he said, very simply, like he was explaining weather. He walked past me and set his box down in the living room and started pulling things off the bookshelf. I put the jewelry box under my arm and went back to the kitchen, and I sat there for a very long time, not drinking the coffee I'd made, not crying, not moving, just recalibrating. Because something had shifted in the last 90 seconds, something about the way he'd said it. And now she's gone. Like that ended something. Like that settled something. I started paying attention. Thursday came. The estate attorney's name was Mr. Felton. Early 60s. Careful. The kind of man who kept his office at exactly the right temperature and offered you water from a glass pitcher. I liked him immediately, which turned out to be useful later. He read the will. My mother had left the house on Birch Creek Road and its contents to me. She'd left a savings account to me. She'd left a small life insurance policy, $30,000, and listed me as the primary beneficiary. She'd left Randall a box of his father's fishing equipment that had apparently been in her garage for 40 years, and a handwritten note that Mr. Felton said he could make available to Randall privately. Randall sat next to me the entire reading with his jaw set in a way that I recognized from the hallway, from the jewelry box, from And Now She's Gone. Afterward, in the parking lot, he stopped me before I got to my car. She wasn't well at the end, he said. You know that. She had a heart attack, I said. She wasn't confused. She was on a lot of medication. People make decisions under those circumstances that don't reflect their real intentions. He paused. I'm telling you this as someone who loved her. I looked at him. At the leather jacket. At the clean truck parked 2 spaces down. I'll talk to you later, Randall, I said. I got in my car and drove back to Birch Creek Road, and I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before I went inside. The call came 11 days later. I had stayed in Harrowfield to deal with the estate, talking to the utility companies, finding a painter to fix the water damage in the upstairs hallway, going through my mother's things with the care they deserved. I'd found her recipe book again, and her photo albums, and a shoebox full of birthday cards I'd made her as a child. Macaroni glued to construction paper, the word Mom spelled in stickers. I had also, quietly, gone through her files. My mother kept everything. It was a quality that had annoyed me as a teenager and that I was now profoundly grateful for. She had a filing cabinet in the spare room, alphabetically organized, rubber-banded by year. Insurance. Car. House. Medical. Bank. It took me 2 evenings to go through it properly. On the second evening, I found a folder labeled Randall's/2019 tucked behind the medical files. Inside was a letter, handwritten, my mother's handwriting. I won't reproduce it word for word, but the substance of it was this. 4 years earlier, Randall had come to her in what she described as a difficult time. Financial trouble she didn't specify, and she had agreed to loan him $40,000. She had written up a simple promissory note. He had signed it. The money had been transferred. He had never repaid it. There were also 3 emails she had printed out from 2021 in which she had asked him, carefully, gently, the way she asked him everly, the way she asked for everything, whether he had any timeline for repayment. His responses were short. He said he was working on it. He said things were complicated. In the last email from November 2021, he said, June, I don't think you understand how much I've done for this family. I would think carefully about how you want to handle this. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I found one more document at the back of the folder, a letter from an attorney I didn't recognize, dated 14 months before my mother died. It concerned a deed. I had to read it twice before I understood what I was reading. The house on Birch Creek Road had been in my mother's family for 30 years. Her parents had bought it. When they died, it had passed to her. The deed had always been in her name, except that according to the letter in the folder, 8 months before my mother died, someone had submitted paperwork to transfer a partial ownership interest in the property, 15%, to Randall. The letter was from an attorney who had apparently reached out to my mother after the fact, because the signature on the transfer documents did not match her signature on file from earlier transactions. My mother had written back to the attorney. I found her draft, unsent, in the folder, saying that she had not signed any transfer documents, that she had not authorized any change to the deed, that she wanted to know how this had happened. There was no follow-up, no response. The draft was dated 9 months ago. She had died 6 weeks after writing it. I sat on the floor of the spare room for a long time. Then I called Mr. Felton. He picked up on the second ring, which I appreciated. I told him what I'd found. I read him the relevant parts. There was a pause on his end that lasted about 4 seconds. "Willa," he said, "I need you to put that folder somewhere safe and not discuss this with your uncle until we've spoken further." "Okay," I said. "Can you come in tomorrow morning?" "Yes," I said. "Good," he said. "Bring everything." I slept 4 hours that night. I kept getting up and checking that the folder was still in my bag, which was a thing I would have found irrational 24 hours earlier. Mr. Felton had a colleague named Ms. Adair. She handled real estate and estate litigation, and she was approximately the most competent human being I have ever encountered in a professional context. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she looked at my documents the way a jeweler looks at something brought in for appraisal, carefully, without emotion, with complete authority. "The deed transfer is potentially fraudulent," she said, after about 15 minutes. "If your mother's signature was forged, that's a criminal matter in addition to a civil one." "What do I do?" I said. "You do nothing yet," she said. "We do nothing yet," she said. "We do the work first. We get a handwriting analysis. We pull the notary records. We find out who submitted these documents and how." "How long does that take?" "Weeks. Maybe a few months." She looked at me over her glasses. "You're going to need to be patient. Can you do that?" I thought about the jewelry box. And now she's gone. About the email that said I would think carefully about how you want to handle this. "Yes," I said, "I can do that." I stayed in Harrowfield. I told Randall I was still working through the estate and would be in touch. He sent me 2 texts over the next month asking about the timeline for the property, which I responded to briefly and without information. I went through my mother's house and I fixed the leaky kitchen faucet. A plumber came, and it took 40 minutes, and I cried a little while he worked, and he pretended not to notice, which was kind. I found a part-time administrative job at a dental office in town, because I'd gone through most of my savings driving up and staying, and Charlotte felt very far away and not quite real anymore. I started running in the mornings, on the road that went past the old Methodist church and down toward the creek. I started cooking from my mother's recipe book. The tomatoes in the garden came up without anyone doing anything, just like they always had, and I waited. Ms. Adair called me on a Wednesday morning in early October. I was in the garden with a coffee mug when my phone rang, and I sat down on the back steps, and she told me what they'd found. The handwriting analysis had come back. The signature on the deed transfer documents was not my mother's. The variation was significant enough that the analyst had used the word definitive. The notary who had stamped the documents had been contacted. She said she had notarized signatures for a man who presented identification, Randall's identification, and that she had not been present for the woman's signature because she was told the woman had already signed and the document just needed witnessing, which was not how notarization works. She had made an error. She understood that now. The county recorder's office had received the documents via mail, with a cover letter signed by Randall. "This is forgery," Ms. Adair said. "Document fraud, potentially elder financial abuse, given the loan." "What happens next?" I said. "We file a report with the county sheriff. We also file a civil suit to have the deed transfer invalidated. And we file a separate claim to recover the $40,000 plus interest." I looked at the tomato plants. They were heavy with late-season fruit that no one had planted. "Okay," I said, "let's do that." I won't pretend the next 4 months were easy. There was a sheriff's visit. There were attorneys. There were phone calls from Randall that I did not answer, and then calls from a man who identified himself as Randall's attorney, which I forwarded to Ms. Adair. There was a family meeting attempted by a cousin I barely knew, who called to tell me I was tearing the family apart, which struck me as a remarkable thing to say given the circumstances. I had Thanksgiving alone in my mother's house and I made her sweet potato casserole recipe and it was exactly right and I cried through most of it. And it was also somehow one of the better Thanksgivings I remember. Randall was charged in December. Forgery, fraud, financial exploitation of an adult. The district attorney's office had also been looking at his finances more broadly and had found that the $40,000 wasn't the only time he'd borrowed money from family members without repayment. There were two other relatives who came forward once the case was public. The civil suit to invalidate the deed transfer was resolved in February. A judge signed the order. The 15% interest Randall had fraudulently claimed was removed from the record. The house on Birch Creek Road was fully mine. He was sentenced in March. I was not in the courtroom. Miss Mary Adair had advised me I didn't need to be, and she was right. I was in my mother's kitchen, making coffee, when she called to tell me. 3 years, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. A restitution order for the $40,000 plus interest to be paid from the proceeds of the sale of his truck and certain other assets. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden, still brown from winter. And I thought about my mother writing that letter to an attorney 9 months before she died. Going to the trouble of drafting a response, filing it in a folder, keeping it. She had known something was wrong. She had started trying to fix it. She just hadn't had enough time. There is a version of this story where I tell you I feel closure. I've heard that word a lot over the past year, from well-meaning people who want the ending to be tidy. And I understand the impulse. I wanted that too, for a while. But what I actually feel is more specific than closure. What I feel is that something was taken and something was given back. Not everything. You can't give back the woman who kept a photograph of me at age 7 inside her jewelry box for 2 decades. You can't give back Tuesday mornings that are supposed to be ordinary. What you can give back is the yellow house on Birch Creek Road, the leaky faucet, now fixed. The recipe book that smells like vanilla and old paper. The garden that grows tomatoes every summer without anyone asking it to. I live here now. I didn't plan to. I thought I'd sell and go back to Charlotte, back to my constructed life. But Charlotte had started to feel like something I'd borrowed and never quite returned. This place was always mine. It just took me a while to understand that some things are yours before you're ready for them. I still run the road past the old Methodist church in the mornings. I still make coffee the way she made it, 1 scoop too many. I started a job at a nonprofit that works with adult protective services. I answer phones. I connect people with attorneys. I listen to a lot of stories that sound something like mine, and some that are much worse. I am not always the most cheerful person in the office, but I am patient. Ms. Adair told me once, during a long afternoon of reviewing documents, that the cases that matter most are rarely the dramatic ones. They're the quiet ones. The ones where someone kept their paperwork in a filing cabinet, alphabetically organized, rubber-banded by year. My mother was the most patient person I ever knew. I'm learning. If you're watching this and there's a folder somewhere in your house, or your parents' house, or your grandmother's house, a folder that you've been meaning to look through, that has been sitting in a drawer or a cabinet or the back of a closet, please go look at it. Not because you'll find what I've found. Most of the time you won't. Most of the time, a folder is just a folder. But my mother kept records because she was organized and careful and, I think, because some part of her understood that the truth sometimes needs evidence. That love is not always enough protection. That a piece of paper, at the right moment, in the right hands, can do something that grief alone cannot. She wasn't here to file the report herself, but she left me everything I needed to do it for her. That's enough. It has to be enough. And most days, most mornings, running past the church, with the creek sound coming up through the trees, it actually is. I used to think patience was something you were either born with or you weren't. My mother had it naturally. She could wait out a long silence, a difficult season, a person who wasn't ready to be honest yet. I always thought I'd gotten the other thing from her. The stubbornness. The part that wants to fix things right now, today, before the feeling gets worse. But this past year taught me something I didn't expect. Patience isn't a personality trait. It's a decision you make over and over, usually when you least want to. When I found that folder in my mother's filing cabinet, my first instinct was to call Randall immediately, to confront him, to make him look at what I was holding and explain himself. I wanted the satisfaction of watching him not have an answer. I wanted it badly. Ms. Adair told me to wait. Mr. Atrinley to wait. Felton told me to wait. And something in me, some quieter part, understood that acting too fast would hand him exactly what he needed. A scene. A family dispute. A situation he could reframe as grief making me irrational. So I waited. I ran in the mornings, I cooked from my mother's recipe book. I answered phones at the nonprofit and listened to other people's versions of this same story. And I let the attorneys do the work my mother had started and hadn't had time to finish. That's the thing about Randall that I keep coming back to. He wasn't stupid. He was calculating. He had looked at my mother, a woman alone, aging, kind to a fault, and made a series of deliberate choices. The loan he never planned to repay. The deed transfer he thought no one would notice. The email where he told her to think carefully about how she wanted to handle things. Each of those was a choice. A small one, maybe, in the moment. But choices compound. They accumulate weight. And eventually, the weight becomes something a courtroom can measure. That's not luck. That's not fate working mysteriously in the background. That's just the simple, unglamorous truth that actions produce consequences. Not always quickly, not always visibly, but reliably. Randall spent years building something out of small dishonesties, and it held until it didn't. Until my mother kept a folder, until I went through her filing cabinet, until a handwriting analyst looked at a signature and said, "This is not her." The tricky part, the part I sit with, is that my mother knew something was wrong, and she still didn't tell me. I think she was protecting me from exactly the kind of year I just had. She was patient in a way that cost her, and I will never fully make peace with that. What I can do is carry the things she left. Not just the house, not just the recipe book. The habit of keeping records. The belief that the truth is worth documenting even when you're not sure anyone will ever read it. The understanding that being quiet is not the same as being weak, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not give someone the reaction they're counting on. I'm not the same person who drove to Harrowfield with 2 suitcases and a grief that hadn't found its shape yet. I'm not entirely sure who I am now, honestly. But I know I'm someone who checks the filing cabinet, someone who reads the folder, someone who calls the attorney and says, "I found something, and I think it matters." My mother raised me to pay attention. It just took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand what I was supposed to be paying attention to.